Brigadier Sharma is not joined yet.
So Brigadier sir will be joining in some time. He is stuck somewhere, so he'll be joining
Okay,
shortly.
sure.
So we can start today's session, and we have our audience as well. So we will try to have questions and discussions and thoughts pouring in as you proceed with your session. So yes, please feel free and go ahead, sir. Looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you. So, a warm welcome to everyone. And I'm Rajat Kanti Mitra. I'm a professor of clinical psychology. And I think today we are going to talk about the grief cycle, the attachment cycle. In fact, just yesterday, there is an article that has come in Outlook. They asked me to write an article on the grieving process in human beings, and they have put it as a lead article. So it's which means that somewhere grieving is a topic that is becoming a concern for everyone. It's there on the awareness of everyone. And when they asked me to write it, one of my issues was that how do I talk about grief for the layperson? And I decided that I will share my two examples, which I'm going to share with. Uh, Around 3 weeks ago, when um, the second wave was at its peak, one of my closest relatives was down with COVID, and we had to take her to get admitted in the COVID hospital. And while we were waiting there for her to get admitted, what I noticed was that there was this a nurse who came to this woman who was sitting, in one corner, uh, and she told her something. And hearing this, she, broke down and started weeping. So then she walked away quickly. So then she came back and said, "Don't cry here, because if you weep here, it's going to affect everyone. So go outside." Nobody really responded to her. So it bothered me, and I spoke to the nurse and the doctor. And what I came to learn from them was that the doctor said, "Look, you must be thinking that I'm a very insensitive person, but I am not. This is the 10th or the 11th, death that I have to disclose, and I'm exhausted. Mentally, I do not know anymore how to go ahead and tell someone that their loved one has died." So I asked the nurse to go ahead and say that. And he said, "Nothing in my medical training has ever prepared me for a situation like this. At the most, I can explain one or two deaths in a day. But when I have to do it dozen, 2 dozen, I realize that it has not been possible." So then I told him that, I'm a grief therapist and I understand. And he said, "Would you take a workshop for all the doctors over here? Because all of us are in grief. We are witnessing so much grief. And it is very difficult to, go ahead and this process." Another incident which I thought of is that, a couple of months back, my mother passed away, and we had to cremate her. And after the person who was arranging the pyre, I gave him some money, as I understood that it's customary. He refused to take it, and he said, once upon a time I could do 4 or 5 at the most pyres, but now I'm doing 25, 30. And I realized that a profound change has come within me. ये जो पैसा है ये आप जो है किसी ऑर्फनेज में दे दीजिए, लेकिन मुझे मत दीजिए. मैं जो है ये भगवान का काम वो करके जो है वो समझ रहा हूँ. Just a minute. So I said, but ये तो आपके लिए. He says नहीं, Now I realize I have to see it as God's work, and that's the only way I can do it. So two different people, both of whom worked with death, or a doctor works with death, a person arranging the pyre works with death, but the COVID has changed them. They are beginning, one is not able to cope with it, and the other has turned to seeing his work as something spiritual, something religious, in order to carry on with his work. Right? So, both issues, what involves is grief, and we will be talking about what is grief and how it works in our life. Let me share with you that grief is not a morbid topic. It is not something, when I talk about, you need to be apprehensive that he's going to talk about something which is very sad, or, full of, negative things. No. In fact, बिफोर दिस वर्कशॉप somebody asked me कि ये जो आप ग्रीफ के बारे में या ह्यूमन अटैचमेंट के बारे में बताएंगे, ये क्या रोने धोने वाला वो है? तो मैंने कहा नो, इट्स गॉट नथिंग टू डू विद दैट. डोंट थिंक ऑफ ग्रीफ एज रोना धोना, but understand grief as a process. In the same way birth is a process and we understand birth, in the same way grief is also a process. They both have been given by nature for us in order to cope with, deal with what is happening in our environment. And the more you naturally understand and accept both, the more it is that you will be able to deal with it. So, to understand grief, we have to start with what we talk of as the human attachment cycle, right? This is from attachment theory, and this is from the works of Dr. John Bowlby, a psychiatrist, a British psychiatrist who started attachment theory almost 50 years ago. He was bothered about the number of children who were orphaned during the World War. And these children were not responding to anyone, were not talking to anyone, just in the same way that we have right now so many children who have been affected in the COVID. They have lost their parents. And he was asked by United Nations to say that what can be done to deal with this massive human problem. And he at that time found that no theory, no approach actually was helping him to deal with this massive human problem. So what he did was he started observing the children who had lost their parents, who had lost homes, who had no sometimes recollection of where they had come from. And out of that, he built up what's known as the attachment theory or process. What he said was that attachment, it begins with proximity. Proximity means closeness, physical nearness, करीबी, निकटता हिंदी में जिसको हम कहते हैं. When we are close to someone, when there is proximity, then it leads to bonding. Bonding is a very different process than what we understand. The closest that we can talk of it in Hindi is संबंध बनाना. लेकिन bonding doesn't mean bhaichara, or bonding doesn't mean that it means an exchange of energy between two people. So if we see, we Indians, we are a deeply bonding culture. We bond with each other. Like, think of the train journey you had. You started talking to the people, and by the time the journey ended, you nearly knew almost everything about each other's family, right? So many relationships, marital relationships have been formed, things have been done. You see, you sit someone next to a park in India, and after some time you will start talking. Not in the West. You may sit the whole day, you may sit for a month. Beyond saying hi, you may not go further. But our cultures are deeply bonding cultures, and it is important to understand that how we may be getting alienated. Sometime last year I was in States, in Washington, and behind the back of some cars I saw a sticker which said, "Have you hugged your child today?" Now, I was very puzzled. I said, "Why is it, there?" And my host explained that recently there was some awareness that we are no longer a bonding culture. We have got so alienated, and therefore there is a school shooting that has taken place. And it's been, during that talk, it was found that most parents did not even know or had not even spoken a word to their children. And if we see that our bonding with our children has also gone down, how do an average parent bonds with the children today? The typical example probably is a father who drops his child to the school. They are both strapped on their seats, and the father starts the car and he said, I heard your mother say that you have not done this, you have not done that. I don't want to listen to this. I can't take it anymore. And after 10 minutes, he drops him or her to the school, and that is the way they are relating to each other. This is probably a typical urban scene, that parents are getting alienated from their children, and therefore the bonding is much less. The COVID is a process by which we can replace that. One of the fathers was complaining to me. He's saying, I'm for the first time I'm at home, I'm at work, I'm doing my work from home. But what I notice is that, the way our children, when we were children, we used to play carom, ludo, interact, go out of the home. Nowadays children just sit with the computer and the phone in their hands, and they don't do anything. So he was complaining about the children that they don't. I said, okay, do you have ludo or carom at home? So he was taken aback. He said, no, we don't. I said, if you don't initiate to play, how will your children learn that there is a ludo and carom to play at home? So he said, yeah, that makes sense. So he ordered ludo and carom through Amazon. He initiated the play, and now they interact as a family. They play together. But this could only take place when the father understood that he is no longer a bonding father anymore. Right? So bonding is crucial. It is something that is as basic as air or water. And all bonding gives rise to separation. No bonding is permanent. So whether a bonding lasts for, say, 5 days or 5 months or 5 years or 50 years, it'll come to an end, either through death or through separation, where people move away from each other, or there are differences. I mean, separation happens in innumerable ways. And we all dread separation. We don't like separation. Separation is termed as a natural killer because it is seen that more people die in this world of separation that they were not prepared for, that they were not ready with. So, for example, think of the major separations you had in life. If you recall, most of them were unexpected, were sudden, they came without warning, and they shook you up. And probably some of the effects are still, there for you. Right? Now, why is separation difficult? Because often separation unlocks the grieving process within us. It will always happen. Whenever we separate, we grieve. And it is not possible to separate miraculously and without going through the grief, life comes back to normal. Grief is something that is a physiological, biological process that helps all living beings to let go of the attachment that is no more and then create proximity and bonding again. And this cycle, as a result, that when we let go of the grief, we create proximity again, and then it leads to bonding. This cycle goes on again and again in life. We have already gone through that many times. And if we have not dealt with the grief, then we have been stuck in this cycle and we have not been able to move on. So the goal in life, in therapy, in psychology, as we realize today, is to let go of the grief that we carry inside as a result of separation, loss that takes place. Yeah. So next slide, please. Attachment is the process of creating a proximity and making a connection. We talked about it. Proximity alone is not enough. Proximity may not lead to attachment until unless we decide So therefore, it's important to maintain the proximity, and therefore it leads to bonding. It's an emotional exchange, and bonding always involves emotions. So, whenever you are bonded to someone, there are emotions involved. Sometimes which are very unconscious, which we don't realize till we move away, from the person. Other day, I was working with someone who had lost his parents, and he said that it was sudden due to COVID, and he said, okay, they were old. I can still understand that, but what I cannot get over it is that there are several things I wanted to tell them, I wanted to resolve with them, and now it will never be resolved. I will have to carry it all my feelings inside within myself. And he said, I only became aware of it after they moved, after they passed away. Right? So I said, okay, I wish you had done that before, but now you can't. That is still possible. And I told him how we do grief work and help people to deal with their grieving process and emotions. So he said, I could have done that if I had focused upon the relationship. I always thought I would do it tomorrow, I would do it a later day. Many times with people with whom we are in relationship, there are serious unresolved issues. And when they move away, or when they go away from us, we realize that that becomes a grief. We wish that we could have shared that, resolved it with them. And that is what I hear in grief therapy again and again. Next, please. Bonding is primarily like air, food, and water. Once upon during Freud's time, it was believed that bonding is not primary. But today we know that it is the foundation for success for people and for organizations. There have been a lot of research done which shows that the best organizations are those which are deeply bonded, in which people are able to bond with the organization. Studies show that many people bond with organizations more than sometimes they bond with their families or relationships. The organization gives them the identity. So, therefore, the reason for attrition most often is not financial reasons alone, but the fact that people want to work in organizations where they get a sense of belonging, where they feel that they belong and it's worthwhile, they are valued. The organizations where people don't feel that they have an identity, or they don't are valued, those organizations are peak performing organizations. For example, we all know that the Japanese organizations, how Japan overtook America, and the reason for that was seen is that the Japanese organizations focus upon bonding. In fact, whenever there was a takeover of an American organization, the first thing that they did was to recreate the geography of the office. They broke down all the walls. They saw to it that people see each other every day. They relate with each other. They sit together and eat lunch. They interact with each other. What they found about American organizations and most European organizations was that they were detached, aloof, cool, and clinical. And they said, how can people work in that? Because people are going to spend 10, 12 hours over here. They need to get the feeling that it's a family. So that's how they changed the geography, and as a result, they found that there were many things that changed. Most of all, the attrition. Right. In fact, Jack Welch, if you read his book about how he changed the fortunes of Chrysler, he said that I was perhaps a brilliant CEO, but when I became a CEO, which could a transforming CEO, and that was after I worked for a year in an organization for disturbed children, and I realized how much is the need for belongingness in human beings, and that is what I suggested, and that is what I that's how I could turn the American car industry once again back to normal, because I realized that people did not feel a sense of belonging and they didn't want to work over here. When people become stuck in all separation and grief, they become hostages. It is a necessary part of making new bonds and becoming alive. It is important that we learn to form, maintain, and renew bonds even in the midst of profound differences or serious conflicts. In fact, the most bonding persons, the most effective persons are those who are actually able to turn around a conflict. They see the energy in the conflict and the bond that is broken. Conflict is recognized, is often seen by attachment theory as differences where the bond has broken down. As long as we have differences, it's not a problem. But when, along with the differences, the bond between us breaks down, then it gives rise to a conflict. So, in conflict resolution, the most important thing is that first we build up the bond with the person. I have taught hostage negotiation in many police academies across the world, and the first thing I teach is that in dealing with hostages, the most important thing is how do you build a bond? How do you build a bond for the time being? It doesn't mean that you become brothers with each other, no, but you address each other, you talk to each other, so that you are able to temporarily form an attachment, so you can negotiate and go for what is the goal that you want to take for. Do you know, for example, why terrorists put black masks over their faces, or bank robbers? They do it to detach themselves. It was believed once upon a time that they do it to hide their face. But many of them said, we don't bother much about hiding our faces. It may be relevant, may not be. But when we put a cloth over our face, the person in front of us becomes an object. And it is not difficult to kill him at that time. And that is what attachment theory also talks about, saying that you can be violent, you can kill another human being only by making the human being an object. You cannot kill another human being, but you can destroy an object. So the process of objectification is something that is extremely relevant in today's world. For example, in terrorist organizations which create detachment, the graduation ceremony lies in killing a person in cold blood. Like we all know that when we are angry, we can hit another person. But can we hit another person or get violent with another person when we are not angry, when they have not done anything? So the training in many places where you have to teach people to kill in cold blood is that you have to first create detachment, and that's why many terrorist organizations, they ask the persons to graduate from them only by killing a person in cold blood. So you destroy the bond. So it doesn't matter when you, for example, you look into a person's eye, there are a lot of hormones released, and you have to prevent that process of bonding from taking place, right? When we shake hands, there are hormones released. When we look at each other, hormones are released, right? When, for example, we hug each other, nearly 200 hormones are released in the body, as studies show, right? Uh, Other day, I was dealing with a conflict issue, and the person who was in a superior authoritative position, he said, "Aankhein nichi karke baat kar." Now, why did he do that? Because he was forming a bond. I have known rapists who had to stop because they looked directly into the eyes of the woman they were assaulting, and they could not go on. So, therefore, very often rapists are known to close the eyes, or ask the woman whom they are raping to close the eyes so that they can carry on with their job. Right. Successful leaders must be able to help themselves as well as others to go through the bonding cycle. The most successful people in this world, whether we take people like Winston Churchill or Gandhi or Subhash Chandra Bose, or say any field, we find that they could create bonds with their followers. Their followers loved them because they could speak directly to them individually. That's a characteristic that great leaders always have. Yeah. Next. So separation is an interruption of the bonding process. It can come in as a result of change, loss, or disappointment. And separation comes in the natural evolution, like growing up, growing older. Like, for example, when we move from school to college, it is separation. When we move, say, from college to working life, when we get married, when we go from one country to another, these are all processes where we separate from what we had, where we are attached to. Very often people ask me that, can you tell me about the, is that so because we are scared, we have a scare of the unknown? And what attachment theory says is that there is nothing called scare of the unknown. It is always scare of letting go of the known, what we are comfortable, what we are attached to. We don't want to move on from there. So when next time you have to move on in life and you think of scare of the unknown, tell yourself that there is nothing much like that, but it's more scare of letting go of the known, what you are comfortable about, because none of us want to move ourselves from that. And many of us believe is that we can be comforted by only what we have lost if that is given back to us. It's just like a child whose toy gets broken. However much you try to comfort the child says, no, I'll be only okay if this toy is somewhat restored to me. But only when the child understands that this toy cannot be restored, it is gone, and I will go on and I will, move on from here. Will I, carry on in life? Many adults are they still grieve with their issues, just the way a child grieves with the broken toy. So that's what grief is about. And next slide, please. So grieving involves the emotional stages of letting go and is essential if human beings have to become resilient to move on and recover and find their personal power. In our society, quite often grief is done through sublimation. The greatest works of art, music, literature, achievements in life happen because very often we deal with grief by putting the energy and converting this into a higher achievement. So most of the world's literature, for example, music, art, or people who achieve, they do so after they go through a terrible loss and convert that loss into an achievement, right? But it's a myth to believe that you cannot do it otherwise. In fact, if you do it, you can do it far better, as successful people often talk about it. Yeah, next. Yeah, so grief is not an emotion, it is a series of stages. The first stage of grief is called denial. Like when you hear a bad news, what is your first reaction? No, it cannot be true. No, I'm hearing wrong. Or, you are not telling me the truth. We protect ourselves by doing that. The purpose of the stages of grief is to protect yourself, right? So the next stage after denial is protest. We are angry because we have lost something. Nobody wants to lose uh, what they hold dear to, what they hold as precious. They get angry with having lost something. So, for example, this the hospital that I was talking about. I saw one of the persons who had died over there. His family saying, "Well, they did not take care of them properly, even though he had been taken care of properly. We did not bring him enough on time." There were many ways in which they were trying to express their protest, their rage at the system, at themselves, at everything around. The ambulance did not drive, fast enough. If we had brought him over here in time, then his condition would not have worsened. Many people, you would notice that when they are talking about their loss or something angrily, they suddenly burst into tears. They start crying. And I think I would say, without being gender biased, is that women do that a lot. They do it more often because they are more spontaneous. Very often, women, while talking angrily about something, they burst into crying. And that is because they go to the third stage of the grieving process, the pining or longing stage, right? It's also the reason why men die 7 years earlier than women, because women are taught to grieve. The grieving process is the same in both. Physiologically, there is no difference. I mean, uh, as a man, someone else as a woman, there is no difference in the way we relate with grief. But men are taught to suppress the grief, not express grief. And that is the reason it has been seen that all over the world, men die 7 years earlier than women. Men, for example, who have two daughters live on an average 10 years older than men who have no daughters, right? For the simple reason being that it is easier for men to bond, to attach with daughters than they do with their sons. It is something that we teach sons not to express their emotions. We ourselves start doing that, and as a result of it, we are not able to go through the stages of grief properly. The fourth stage of grief is fear, terror, or panic. Now, have you ever wondered why is it that a woman who's been abused by her husband doesn't leave him? Despite counseling, despite therapy and help, she still goes back to that abusive husband. This is because of the fourth stage. People get so scared of moving on in life because they feel that the known, the comfortable is what they can still live with, but something unknown is not, uh, possible. So that's the stage when many counselors would tell you that they feel very frustrated because many people refuse to reach out to the new, to the unknown because of fear. The fifth stage is rationalization, which means finding meaning. The stage after that is acceptance, which is the emotional counterpart of rationalization. Rationalization is, the process where, for example, you hear, जो होनी होती है उसको कौन टाल सकता है, whom God's love die young. These are all rationalizations created by society. And very often, when we undergo a loss, this is what we try doing in counseling with the person. It doesn't work. What is important is that people have to go through the previous stages before they are ready for rationalization. So that's why most often when we find that we try to comfort but kuch ho nahi raha hai, that's because it doesn't come as part of a process. It comes across as something imposed by society, by others. That so. Acceptance, then comes forgiveness. Forgiveness means letting go. Forgiveness doesn't mean saying I'm sorry. Forgiveness means that I will not give power to what is hurting me and what is causing me pain. So very often holding on to grief is given by an example of a clenched fist like this. We clench the fist, and after some time what happens? We hold on to the memory, the things of the person. It starts hurting. And how do we give over this hurt? By holding on to it? No, just by releasing it. So that's letting go. We let go of the memory. It's not that we will forget the person. We letting go does not mean that we will ever forget. We will always remember, but we can change the way we feel about the memory or about the loss, and that is what letting go means. So I stop suffering. I change the way I feel about the issue. The last stage of grief is sorry, what's called rebonding, where we move to the new phase. I used to work with the adoption agency of the government, and one of the things we were asked to find is that why do so many adoptions fail? Why is it that so many adoption, even despite the parents giving, adoptive parents giving all the material comforts, everything else, the children, when they grow up as teenagers, they either want to run away or they ask that are you our adoptive parents, even though they may have never told them. But the reason which has been found through a lot of adoption researches is that parents who adopt children, they have never grieved over the fact that they cannot have biological children of their own. So when they adopt, it is as a substitute, it is to deal with their grief. The child comes in the family to deal with the grief of parents who could not have biological children. And children sense that biologically the bond never deepens, they never happens like the way a parent child bond should happen. So the child senses something amiss, something that has not taken place, and therefore he asks. So when those parents who could not, they are again helped to deal with their grief that they never had, maybe something like 15, 20 years back. When they grieve, they say that it's for the first time that we are able to bond with our children. Next slide, please. So in the pandemic, we are going through different kinds of losses and giving rise to different kinds of grief. You can read it. I will not go into it. Loss of attachment, territory, structure, identity. For example, today we live at home. We are not going out. Our structure, our schedules, it's all changed. And what changes with structures and schedules? Our identity. Who am I right now? Sitting at home and doing all these things. And I was doing all these things earlier outside. So we may think that why it should be so, but for all of us, we have invested tremendous amount of energy in being who we are through the structures. If you have worked in an organization for 20 years, you've invested 20 years of your life in that organization. If you have been at a place for say many years, you have invested your energy, your passion in that. So leaving that and starting something again is not easy for anyone until unless you let go of the grief that you are facing it inside. Yeah. The It's important that we understand that grief has also been understood throughout the ages. Historically, grief probably was much better understood than what it is right now. Like in our epic Mahabharata, Sri Krishna deals with the grief of Arjun, who says that I cannot kill my parents, my relatives, the people who are like my parents in whose laps I grew up. He helps him to deal with the grief. He explains to him about the nature of grief, and Arjuna is able to let go of the grieving process and then start again and gets into the war. Yeah, next slide, please. So these are the different kinds of losses that we are facing right now during the COVID times, and you can understand for yourself what you are, which loss is yours, what you are going through. The important thing is to talk about it, maybe with a counselor, maybe with a trusted friend, and not lock yourself up in the grief. Next slide, please. So pandemic, as we talked about, we are going through, and separation. Pandemic is a stage of separation from a certain order that we were living in before that. Our life was ordered. We are right now going through a new reorder. But in going from order to reorder, we cannot do that directly. We have to go through a stage of disorder. So, and disorder is marked by chaos or confusion. It is not possible to go from order to reorder straight away. Think of your life, the major transitions that took place. Could you straight away create a new reorder in your life? No, you went through a period of introspection, a disorder where you had to look inside on many things, on your beliefs, on the ideas that you held as true. There was a doubt. You asked questions to people, and finally, it led to reorder. Sometimes these processes are small. We don't notice it, But sometimes these are big, like the COVID one at the present, and that's why we are noticing it. We will cross this earlier order. We cannot go back to the earlier way of living anymore. That's one thing for sure. People have changed, people have transformed in this period. We will go through all this and create a new reorder. We only don't know when this reorder will come and what will it be like. That's very important to know. But it will come, it is definitely on its way. And when that happens, we will have to reorganize ourselves and become different. This is the story of human civilization. We have adapted time and again to new stresses, new challenges, and new narratives, and always come out successful. No other species has that ability. And in fact, if COVID has taught us anything more, something more than anything else, it is that human beings are deeply adaptive. Like when the mm, pandemic came, we started wearing masks, we started maintaining distance, we started following rules. No other species can do that at such a massive level that we did it. Of course, some people didn't, but most of us, many of us, we did that. And that is how the human species is surviving and will survive. Right. So, with that, I come to an end of this lecture on grief. And if there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer that. The last one, which I want to show you, the next slide, please. Before is what I've already talked about. It is that grief is to be understood, it is not to be feared. Modern societies are losing touch with how to deal with grief. Today, grief is sanitized. We die, we don't talk about it, we are supposed to cover it up, we should not. It comes to an end when we allow it to finish. Like, for example, one of the things which I notice is that when somebody cries, what do we tell? Rote nahi hai, chup ho jao. No. What is important is that you are interfering with the grief of that person. Can they keep on crying forever? Can they keep on dealing with it forever? No. They're going through a phase. They will come to an end. What is important is to help them to say that, okay, finish your grief and I'm there to support you. It's a psychosocial phenomena and it needs to be taught as a natural part of living and existence, right? And all religions teach us how to deal with grief and face it courageously, right? So, with that, I come to an end, and this is. I'm glad that you all sat through it and liked it. So,
Well, thank you
thank
so
you
much.
very much.
Thank you so much, sir. It is actually a very insightful session. I just have a question related to this slide which you have just shared. Since we are very small, very young, our parents tell us that don't cry, because if you cry, it shows weakness, and
Yeah.
we also tend to tell our children that don't cry, because if you cry, it shows that you are not that strong. So, and as you said, that grief is a process wherein you tend to vent out by crying and express your emotions. So if we tell our people and children in the beginning that do not cry as it's a sign of weakness, how can we express our grief in the later phase of our life?
The grief stays locked up inside you if you have not expressed it. So I deal as part of grief work. People are grieving over issues that they never dealt with 40, 50, 60 years ago, right? What is important is that think of the major losses in your life and ask yourself, could I express my emotions at that time with any person with any secure base? A secure base is a source of comfort. If not, seek out a counselor or a psychologist and share it with them, deal with it. So it may be still there, right? Some time back, my mother who passed away, she said that, she she came almost 60 years ago to Delhi, and there were some issues she wanted to talk to with someone. So I said, "You have stored them for 60 years?" She said, "Yes, as a woman, I thought, I should not be sharing this, but these things have been paining me, and I've held on to this for all these years." So the person she wanted to speak to, I made a connection, and she could talk. and they talked for hours, and she explained, why she wanted to do that. She was not a very emotional person, but once she said that, she told me that, this is what I was waiting for. Now I'm feeling at peace with myself. So it is important to know that, for example, something that you have not dealt with, have not come to terms with, maybe it's a broken relationship, maybe it's the death of someone, maybe it is shifting home, shifting geography, or anything in life you may not have been able to share. I've I have dealt with people who are still dealing with the grief of the partition, of the Holocaust, of a war in which they lost a loved one 50 years, 40 years ago, and they were not able to deal with it. And when they, very often when they retire, when they become free, they realize that the grief has remained locked up inside, them.
Okay.
Sir, I
Thank
have a question for you.
That's Richa, is it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
If you
Would
could
you
share-
mind?
Yeah.
Would you mind switching on the camera for?
Only if you're comfortable, Richa. Otherwise, we can go ahead with that.
I would prefer if we can just go ahead.
Sure.
Okay, then
Please,
go ahead. No problem.
All right. So, sir, I would like to know a couple of techniques that you use with your clients in therapy when you're working with grief. So, anything that you recommend, any techniques that you use in your clinical work, if you could share with us.
Sure, I can share with you the principle. I cannot share it's not possible to show the technique over here. The first is to say that grief is finite, that grief will come to an end. Second is to make the person aware that they are in the middle of a grieving process which they never completed. So, hello, yes?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, fine. So they are in the middle of a grieving process which got interfered with, which they could never finish. Like, for example, someone told me that he never grieved over the death of his father because throughout, when he died, it was sudden, it was a police case. And, he was so caught up with, dealing with everything. And then he said, I just decided to put a lid over it and go on. So I said, okay, would you like to open that lid and let go? So he says, yes, I would, because it is causing me a deep sense of conflict inside and pain. So I said, you haven't dealt with the grief remains inside you. You can let go of it. I explained to him through the chart about the process, asked him which stage he's stuck in. And he said, I'm stuck in the stage of anger, a protest, because his father, the police case in which that happened, those who killed his father were never caught, and he remained extremely angry with the system, with everyone, including his father, because he felt that he did not take enough precautions for himself. So he talked about it, and I told him that these are the stages you can go through, and he went through that stages. He could express the anger that he felt in that towards people, towards including his mother. And then he dealt with the loss of his father for the first time. He cried, and then he rationalized it. He found a meaning, and then he could rebound again by saying that I let go of you. I've held this hatred inside for so long. So it's a process that you carry out in therapy by explaining it to the clients, empowering them, telling them that it lies within their power to go through these stages and work through that.
All right, sir. So thank you. This was a case of, I think, complicated or prolonged grief.
Yeah.
Anything you could help us out with while we're dealing with acute grief? Apart from encouraging the client to actually express their emotions, probably
If the person is, sure. If the person is middle of an acute grief and dealing with that themselves, then you don't interfere with it. And remember one thing is that grief is deeply individualistic. Everyone deals with it in their own way. I mean, a mother dealt with the grief of her son by keeping his room exactly as it is, even many years after it is gone. And she showed me, and she asked me that, am I doing the right thing? Because many people say that don't do this. So I said, okay, that's the way you have dealt with it, coped with it for all these years, and I'm no one to share whether you should do it or not. But I believe that somewhere you are suffering inside. I mean, doing this does not give you any sense of joy, that you are missing something that in your life. So she says, yes, that's right. I suffer. I cry every day. And I said, it's been a long time. So you are still grieving. You are still suffering over that. And that's what I would not consider it okay. But she said, if I, try to remove anything, any article from him, I feel I'm being disrespectful towards him. I said, no. Would he like you to suffer? I want to ask you, if he were to see you doing this every day, what would he say? She said, he would say, Ma, stop suffering like this. I said, okay. Then are you being respectful towards that opinion of his? She said, no. I said, okay, then I think you have answered it yourself. Next few weeks later, she said, I have started removing the things, from his room, changing it, and I realized that I'm doing it okay. So it's very important to respect what people are doing. Never try to interfere with that. Only if they ask you that whether we should do it or not, and when you see them suffering, when you see them suppressing their grief, should you go ahead and say that this is not okay?
Okay, sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you. You've addressed my questions very.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing your question with us. So we also have something in the chat. I think Ashwin mentioned that I feel emotional attachment is also cause for grief. As per my experience and power to let go, I feel shall help here. So I think that's something he wanted to share. We also have a question, sir, how to manage short-term and long-term grief?
I think grief is, there is nothing as far as I know, which is when grief is something that you suppress and don't deal with it, it becomes a long-term grief. And sometimes the process of grief, it cannot be dealt with in a day. Grief takes time. It takes approximately 6 months to a year, approximately, for deep losses and coming to terms with that and moving on. And there is simple grief and complicated grief. All grief is, perhaps attached to each other. So, for example, if I go through grief in my life right now, it's also connected to all the previous losses, all the previous, griefs in my life if I haven't dealt with it. So they are connected like a chain. So therefore, it is very often said that if I'm grieving for something right now, I may be grieving for all the losses in my life. So it's important to know when dealing in grief work is that which is the deepest loss that you are dealing with right now. And what I hear people is that when they are talking about the current loss, it is actually sometimes they may be grieving about something from the past that they haven't come to terms with, which is a far deeper loss for them. So grief is connected with each other, all griefs, all losses, if we have not dealt with that. And often this is not a forum for that, but what we have in grief workshops is that we ask people to draw a grief chart and link out the deepest grief in their life, and then whether they would like to work with that or not, because that is attached to all the griefs previously which has taken place.
Thank you so much. So we have one final question from Preeti. Grief is a finite process. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It ends.